Lecture 1, Corporal Jackie, Baboon, World War I. On the 25th of August, 1915 in Potchefstroom, a clerk drags Ma's attestation papers across a scarred desk, and Private Albert John Ma leans in close enough that his shoulder almost touches the ink blotter. He is 26, from Pretoria, and he writes himself into the 3rd South African Infantry Regiment with the kind of ordinary penstroke that turns a body into a unit of supply. The same hand that signs Service Number 4927 also tightens on a short chain, because the second body beside his boot is not a recruit at all but a Chacma baboon, Papio ursinus, sitting upright with its forearms tucked like it understands the performance. The Union of South Africa is 5 years old, the South African Overseas Expeditionary Force wants volunteers, and a board bureaucratic room has to decide what to do with a primate that cannot sign but can still be counted. Ma does not solve the problem by persuading the army, because the army is not a person. He solves it by stepping into a specific office with a specific officer. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Francis Thackeray, commanding the 3rd SAI, often called the Transvaal Regiment, listens to a request that should, in a rational universe, die of embarrassment before it reaches a desk. He does not throw Ma out, he instead moves the request into the only language the institution trusts, and he makes a choice that has teeth. He authorizes the baboon's presence not as a private indulgence but as a regiment-level mascot. The moment Thackeray nods, the room's mood shifts from laughter to logistics, because permission in a chain of command is a lever, and levers move consequences. Ma tugs the chain once to keep Jackie from exploring the colonel's boots, and in that tug you can already hear the war machine whirring, delighted to have found a new slot to file something into. A quartermaster's hand then turns that nod into paper that can be stacked, stamped, and argued over. Someone writes a supply depot number, someone issues a paybook, someone tallies rations, because cute stowaway becomes problem we are now resourced to tolerate. The instant food is accounted for. Later testimony insists Jackie was on army strength with an identity disc, which is the military's tiny metal promise that if a body is found, the body can be named, and naming is the first step toward paperwork. Ma signs again, not for himself this time but for an animal that cannot read the ledger, and the ink binds him to liability in a way affection never does. Jackie shifts his weight on the hard ground and flicks his eyes at the movement of hands, because primates are built to track who controls resources, even when the resources are biscuits counted by a man in khaki. The archive that results from this moment behaves like every archive. It keeps what the institution needs and drops the rest like a shed skin. No official enlistment form for Jackie sits neatly in surviving files, and that absence doesn't prove a hoax so much as it exposes how World War I systems treated edge cases. If the anomaly doesn't break drill, the machine keeps marching. Someone somewhere likely wrote a line in regimental orders at Potchefstroom in August 1915, and someone else likely decided, years later, that a baboon did not deserve the same archival tenderness as a rifleman who could spell his surname. This is how myths grow without anyone lying. You simply let the boring paperwork survive and let the weird paperwork evaporate. Ma folds his copy of whatever he's handed, stuffs it into his kit, and walks away from the desk as if the desk is done with him, even though the desk has only just begun. The first stubborn artifact that pins Jackie to more than campfire retelling is not a speech or a medal but a photograph dated the 15th of September, 1915. A camera shutter snaps at Potchefstroom, and the emulsion captures a small baboon among South African troops, the kind of visual evidence that doesn't care what later narrators want. The date matters because it lets you triangulate a body. Jackie looks juvenile in 1915, which fits later press that described the baboon as about 4.5 years old in 1918, and it fits the idea of an infant taken in around 1914. Photographs don't give you motives, but they do give you scale, posture, and presence, and in this one the presence is almost insolent, a primate placed inside a human formation like a wrong note that everyone has decided to harmonize with. The men in the frame stand in lines, Jackie sits in the gap, and the gap is the story. As the story propagates through memoirs and newspapers, small human errors breed like flies in summer heat. One later retelling misnames the handler as Andrew, and that wrong name replicates because audiences love a tidy narrative more than they love checking military records. Researchers like Vincent Carruthers have pushed back by pinning the human anchors down. Albert Ma is the man, and the family names Frank Ma and Harriet Mort belong in the background if you care about reconstructing a life instead of polishing a legend. In a world where millions of men were processed into units, even a simple parental detail becomes a stabilizing weight against drift. A clerk in 1915 can stamp 4,927 and move on. A historian in the 21st century has to move backwards, lifting each surviving fragment like a bone from dust. Then a British provincial paper complicates the whole thing with one line of type. In November 1918, the Loughborough Echo refers to Jackie as a female baboon aged 4.5 years, a claim that collides with the near-universal geek of most military storytelling. A printer sets those words in lead and ink, and the sentence outlives everyone involved because paper is how human institutions pretend to be permanent. Photographs of a young chacma don't make sex obvious, size and manner development can lag, and a juvenile body refuses to cooperate with a human desire for confident labels. It's possible the army assumed, it's possible later narrators masculinized by habit, it's possible the Echo had better information than the rest or simply made a mistake, and all of those possibilities force you to watch humans do what humans always do, shove an animal's body through our categories so the story feels comfortable to repeat. The record also hints at another quiet truth. Jackie was taken for granted by those who lived with him before he was publicized by those who didn't. The earliest concrete mentions cluster in later press pieces and post-war recollections, which suggests that in 1915 a baboon in camp was astonishing but not yet a headline worth shipping across oceans. The fact pattern is still anchored, attestation at Potchefstroom on the 25th of August, 1915, photograph on the 15th of September, 1915, and later soldier testimony about paybook, rations, and identity disc. Everything else, how shocked the enlistment officers were, whether the request was laughed at or met with stony professionalism, gets embellished because a century of readers keep tugging at the same loose thread. The temptation is to demand a single authoritative document that resolves all uncertainty, but war bureaucracies rarely gift you that. They hand you a pile of inconsistent scraps and dare you to build a fair model from wreckage. Before Potchefstroom, before the desk and the stamps, there is a small holding near Pretoria that people later called Cheshire Farm in Villa area. Mile walks that land on the outskirts of the Magaliesberg region where baboons are not exotic symbols but local weather, loud, present, occasionally destructive, and smart enough to make farmers swear at the sky. Somewhere between 1913 and 1915, men hunted troop because colonial authorities paid bounties for baboons that raided crops, turning wildlife control into a crude economy. A rifle cracks, bodies drop, and the aftermath produces an infant clinging to the idea of warmth because infant primates are built to cling before they are built to flee. Ma bends down, scoops the baby up, and chooses care over closure, a decision that takes about 5 seconds and then rewires the next decade of his life. He doesn't carry the infant like a trophy, he carries it like something that might break. Jackie clings with human-like hands that are already capable of closing around fabric, and Ma feeds the animal and keeps feeding it, which is how dependency becomes attachment without anyone giving a speech about love. The baboon's biology does most of the work. In the first years, survival is a negotiation with whoever provides food and safety, and imprinting is simply the brain's shortcut for, this creature equals not dying. In a wild troop, that shortcut points toward mothers, siblings, and dominance hierarchies. In a farmhouse near Villa area, it points toward a young man with grease under his nails and a routine that repeats daily. Jackie learns the rhythms of kettles, doors, and voices before it learns the shifting alliances that would have governed it in the bush. When war breaks out in 1914, the household experiment is already deep into the developmental window that makes it hard to undo. Jackie is roughly 1 to 2 years old, which in baboon terms is still a period of intense imitation and high dependency, and the animal follows Ma the way young primates follow any stable anchor. Ma moves through the yard and the house, Jackie trails, climbs, perches, and watches, because baboon cognition is tuned to bodies, not to abstractions. The point isn't sentimentality, it's neurophysiology. A primate brain assigns enormous predictive value to the movements of whatever creature controls access to food and comfort. Once that bond locks in, separation isn't just sad, it's a stressor that can trigger panic, aggression, or desperate clinging, and that becomes a practical constraint the moment Ma considers leaving home. A juvenile baboon stays cute only if you ignore the timetable written into its muscles and teeth. Chacmas reach adolescence around 3 to 5 years, and the shift is not philosophical, it is hormonal, skeletal, and behavioral, as play becomes testing and testing becomes the rehearsal for dominance. The hands that look charming when they steal a biscuit also have the dexterity to open latches, unbutton tunics, and manipulate objects like tools, and the teeth behind them are not human teeth but weapons evolved for competition. Every month after 1914 is a month of increasing strength and increasing risk, whether the baboon is on a veranda in Villa area or on a parade ground in Potchefstroom. Ma can scold an infant, he cannot negotiate with an adolescent primate the way he negotiates with a human co-worker, and that mismatch is the first operational debt that follows Jackie into uniform. Jackie tests boundaries the way primates test boundaries, with fingers first, then with insistence. The animal hooks a hand into a pocket and explores what fabric hides, because a baboon's world is full of edible surprises tucked into bark and soil, and human pockets are just better designed trees. It pulls at buttons because buttons are grab points and because manipulation is how juvenile primates learn cause and effect without formal instruction. If you want a mechanism for why the later knife and fork stories aren't automatically nonsense, start here. A baboon's grip strength, tactile sensitivity, and curiosity are not add-ons, they are core equipment. The same body plan that lets Papio ursinus peel fruit and pry roots out of hard ground can also pry open the polite assumptions of a mess hall. Ma, meanwhile, does what young men across the Union of South Africa do in 1915, he chooses. He walks away from Pretoria routines, steps into Potchefstroom, and signs for overseas service under the South African Overseas Expeditionary Force at a time when the state depends on volunteers rather than conscripts. The choice is made in ink, but it is lived in packing. He rolls blankets, checks kit, and prepares to trade the Magaliesberg horizon for a transport stream that points north and then, eventually, toward Europe. The question of Jackie isn't sentimental, it's immediate. Does he lock the baboon in a yard and hope a family member can handle it? Or does he haul a growing primate into the most regimented environment available and pray discipline can replace a troop? Ma loops the chain over his hand and answers the question by moving, because movement is how humans turn decisions into realities. He brings Jackie to a training camp not by magic but by brute logistics. The chain stays short as they move through Potchefstroom in late August 1915, because a baboon in a new environment will explore. An exploration is how accidents happen. A train or wagon ride is not just transportation, it is sensory overload, dust, metal, unfamiliar smells, and the baboon's acute hearing and wide visual field make every jolt a potential threat. Ma keeps the animal close, which is what handlers do when they understand that primates can bolt, bite, or climb in a second if startled. Every step toward the parade ground is also a step toward other humans who did not agree to share space with a semi-domesticated wild animal, and that consent gap is the tension humming under the comedy. At Potchefstroom in September 1915, recruits react the way people react when a category gets violated in front of them. Many have grown up calling baboons vermin and thieves because baboons raid orchards and steal food, and a creature you curse on a farm doesn't automatically become a comrade in a camp. Men point, men laugh, some likely keep a cautious distance, because even a juvenile chakma can injure a hand with one bite. Jackie doesn't diffuse the tension with abstract virtue, Jackie diffuses it with behavior that fits into the men's routines. The baboon sits upright and attentive, later observers call it an impressive bearing, and the posture reads as evaluation ready in a place obsessed with posture. Drill turns the camp into a repetitive laboratory, and Jackie gets dragged into the experiment by proximity. A company forms up, boots thud, a sergeant snaps commands that are designed to override individual impulse with group rhythm. Jackie grips a small wooden rifle, an object that is simultaneously a joke, a prop, and a training tool because it gives the baboon something to do with its hands besides grab people. The animal steps when the line steps, not because it understands imperial geopolitics, but because synchronized movement is one of the oldest primate social technologies. Moving with the group reduces conflict and signals belonging. A baboon that can match cadence can hack human perception. The men start interpreting motion as drill instead of random primate chaos, and that interpretive flip is a survival advantage. Standing at ease is where the performance becomes mechanically interesting. A human recruit learns the posture through shouted correction and repetition, and a baboon learns it through the same loop, only translated into attention, food, and the relief of being left alone. Jackie plants its feet apart and tucks its hands behind its back because the posture is a stable pattern that gets rewarded, and primate brains love stable patterns that predict outcomes. The body doesn't have to understand symbolism to learn contingencies, it only has to notice that certain shapes of the limbs make humans relax. Ma watches for the moment the animal wobbles and then steadies, because he's not teaching patriotism, he's teaching a set of movements that will keep officers from ordering the baboon removed. Saluting pushes the cognitive demand higher because saluting is not just a motion, it's a motion aimed at specific targets. When an officer approaches, perhaps Thackeray himself or another commissioned man in the Transvaal regiment, Jackie raises an arm in a rough approximation of the human salute, and the camp reacts like the baboon has performed a miracle. The miracle is actually discrimination. The animal is sorting humans into categories using cues like insignia, posture, entourage behavior, and Ma's own microsignals on the chain. Primates do this kind of sorting all day in wild troops, reading rank and intent from bodies because bodies broadcast status. The baboon doesn't need to read a badge's meaning, it only needs to learn that badges correlate with the humans who trigger particular reactions from everyone else. The mess table is where the story becomes specific enough that it can be tested against anatomy. Jackie uses a knife and fork, which means the hands are not only strong but precise, capable of controlling angles and grip pressure the way humans do when they cut meat. The baboon drinks from a basin or teacup, in the proper manner, which is less about etiquette and more about motor control, lips, jaw, and hands coordinating so liquid goes in rather than down the chest. Soldiers pass a pipe or cigarette, and Jackie learns to hold it and puff because a board camp will reward anything that reads as human imitation. The behavior is funny, but it's also a demonstration of a primate's ability to map observed actions onto its own body, a kind of embodied translation that makes training plausible even without language. Men laugh, then keep handing over objects, and each handover is a tiny reinforcement schedule turning novelty into routine. Once the routine sticks, someone finalizes the spectacle in cloth. A tailor measures, cuts khaki fabric, and stitches a miniature uniform because uniforms are how militaries turn bodies into symbols, and a baboon in a uniform becomes a moving emblem. A regimental cap gets fitted with brass badges and buttons, and the metal matters because it adds weight and clink, odd sensory input for an animal used to fur and skin. The scratchy wool touches Jackie's body, and the baboon tolerates it not out of panache, in any mystical sense but because habituation is a real biological process. Repeated exposure without harm reduces stress responses. Ma adjusts the cap, checks the fit, and keeps the animal from tearing at unfamiliar seams, because a primate will try to remove irritating stimuli unless taught otherwise. In a camp designed to strip individuality down to kit and serial numbers, the baboon becomes an individuality engine, ironically, because he has been dressed like everyone else. Training works here because Potchefstroom supplies the conditions primate learning likes, dense repetition under social pressure. Commands repeat, parades repeat, inspections repeat, and the reward and punishment loops are so regular that even humans complain about boredom. Jackie watches the same sequences and gets prompted into the same sequences, and the baboon's brain is tuned for exactly this kind of observational learning, because wild juveniles survive by copying older troop members' threat cues and foraging tricks. Ma times the reinforcement, food, praise, the simple relief of not being grabbed, and the timing matters because conditioning is sensitive to sequence. A salute becomes a conditioned arm movement because the attention comes right after. Standing at ease becomes a self-soothing posture because it predicts peace. The war machine doesn't need Jackie to understand rules, it only needs Jackie to behave predictably. The same hands that hold a fork also create new problems the moment the camp relaxes. Jackie reaches for unattended kit, tugs at straps, and explores pockets because a baboon's curiosity is not a personality quirk. It is an adaptive strategy for finding calories and tools in a variable environment. Tunic buttons are just manipulable nodes to fingers designed for bark, and a human who forgets that learns quickly. Men start guarding their things, not because they've turned against the mascot, but because the mascot is an animal with a primate's opportunistic logic. That logic doesn't care about private property, it cares about what can be grabbed. The same dexterity that makes the mess hall tricks plausible also makes the camp's discipline problem more complicated, and the complication becomes serious the moment you add weapons, strangers, and fatigue. Paperwork shows up again to keep the complication from becoming a scandal. A quartermaster counts rations, and Ma signs for them because once food exists on paper, the institution expects someone to reconcile it. A supply depot number is written down somewhere because numbering is how the military prevents resources from evaporating into, we lost it, and even an animal becomes a resource once it is fed and clothed by the state. A paybook, absurd as it sounds, is a portable record of entitlement, and entitlement is how you prevent fights over who gets what in a camp full of hungry men. The bureaucracy doesn't see fur, it sees a line item that has to be balanced. Ma, by accepting the line item, accepts the obligation that follows it like a shadow. Obligation turns quickly into risk management, and risk management is never poetic. Someone decides where Jackie sleeps on a rainy night at Potchefstroom, because weather changes animal behavior, and a wet, cold primate is a stressed primate. Someone decides who grabs the chain during inspection, because if an officer leans in too close and gets bitten, the mascot stops being cute and becomes a disciplinary incident. The chain of command has to incorporate the baboon without pretending the baboon is human. The simplest solution is to make Ma the permanent handler, the single throat to choke if something goes wrong. That arrangement isn't about ownership, it's about accountability, the foundational drug of every military system. Once the baboon is officially present, the question isn't whether he belongs emotionally, it's who gets blamed when nature asserts itself. The context that makes these choices possible is not a magical South African fondness for absurdity, it's a young state trying to act like an old empire. The Union of South Africa, founded in 1910, sits inside the British Empire and treats overseas deployment as a performance of maturity. In 1915, recruiters rely on volunteers, so persuasion happens through posters, speeches, and peer pressure rather than through conscription notices. Ma responds by walking into Potchefstroom and signing, and around him other men do the same, turning a civic choice into a military inventory. Trains and wagons haul them toward camps, clerks issue kit, sergeants teach drill, because modern war begins not with gunfire but with standardization. A baboon in that environment is not a symbol of chaos, it's a stress test of how far standardization can stretch. The 3rd South African Infantry draws heavily from Transvaal and Rhodesian volunteers, a mix pulled from mining towns and rural districts where people already live near wildlife that refuses to stay politely outside. Men who have chased baboons off crops do not automatically regard a baboon as an alien impossibility, they regard it as a difficult animal that must be managed. That familiarity shifts the threshold of what counts as thinkable, and thinkability matters in an institution where most rules are unwritten and enforced by habit. A London clerk might freeze at the sight of a primate in khaki. A Transvaal volunteer is more likely to ask, practically, whether it bites and whether it can be kept under control. The camp becomes a negotiation between bush logic and European military formality, held together by the only thing both cultures respect: routine. Colonial military culture also comes pre-lubricated with muskets, because men in chronic fear will grab any stabilizing ritual they can keep alive. South African formations and British regiments carry dogs, goats, monkeys, and antelope, not as official doctrine but as unit identity in motion. The 1st South African Infantry has a springbok antelope named Nancy that can be marched in parades, turning a piece of home into a moving emblem you can feed. Muskets are tolerated because they raise spirits, and spirits matter because a soldier who laughs sometimes is a soldier who doesn't collapse every time the anxiety spikes. Officers may not say this out loud, but they behave as if they know it, because they allow the animals to stay. When Thackeray approves Jackie, he isn't inventing a practice, he's escalating it. Even baboon muskets are not unprecedented in the imperial ecosystem. British regiments have kept chacma baboons with names like Jacko of the 2nd East Yorkshire Regiment and Don of the 2nd Middlesex Regiment, imported pre-war from South Africa and treated as living curiosities in uniformed company. Those cases function like cultural precedent, the kind of story soldiers carry around as permission: we've done this before, so we can do it again. Precedent doesn't make it safe, it makes it plausible enough to attempt. A primate in khaki still sits right on the edge of morale hack and court-martialable disaster, and the edge gets sharper at night when fatigue lowers patience and startle responses rise. But precedent makes officers less likely to slam the door, which is all the baboon needs at the beginning. The wider war environment makes these morale hacks feel less like whimsy and more like crude adaptation. The Western Front that South African infantry will reach in France in April 1916 is industrialized warfare at its most relentless: trenches, barbed wire, machine guns, artillery barrages, and gas attacks that turn air into hazard. Men dig because digging is survival. They drive spades into clay, pile sandbags, and carve shelter into mud while listening for shells by sound, a form of acoustic prediction that becomes second nature. Technology increases killing efficiency, and the human nervous system responds by searching for anything that reduces uncertainty, even for a minute. A mascot does not stop a shell, but it can interrupt the brain's loop of dread, and interruption is a kind of medicine. Trench life also becomes an ecology that punishes bodies for being bodies. Soldiers scrape mud off boots, wring damp cloth, and pick at lice because parasites turn sleep into a negotiation with your own skin. Rats fatten on refuse and the dead, and the sight of them rewires what normal means, not through philosophy but through repeated disgust. The horror isn't only violence, it's the routine terror of living under constant threat where boredom can last for days and then be punctured by seconds of annihilation. In that sensory world, cordite, rot, wet wool, an animal that feels warm and alive becomes a psychological anchor, even when it's also an operational headache. The army doesn't encourage mascots out of kindness, it tolerates them because men need something alive that isn't trying to kill them. The numbers at Delville Wood in July 1916 show why any stabilizer becomes precious. During the Somme offensive, roughly 3,000 South Africans enter that patch of forest, and only about 750 walk out, with around 140 unwounded. Those numbers are not metaphor, they are arithmetic written in bodies, and they explain why the emotional economy of a unit changes. Men who expect catastrophic loss treat small comforts like ration items, limited, precious, hoarded when available. A mascot, in that setting, is not a distraction from reality, it is a tool for staying functional long enough to keep obeying orders. And because this is war, The tool is also a living thing that did not consent to becoming a tool. Back in Pretoria, before the wood and the trenches exist as personal memory, Ma's hands belong to a different system of pipes and schedules. He works as a plumber with the South African railways and harbours, which means he spends days solving physical problems the honest way, by tightening, sealing, and keeping water and steam where they're supposed to be. A tradesman's life is a long education in cause and effect. If you fit the wrong joint, it leaks, and if it leaks long enough, the system fails. That kind of practical attention is exactly what a handler needs when living with a primate whose hands can undo your careful work in seconds. Ma doesn't have the luxury of romanticizing Jackie as a mystical creature. He has to manage the animal as a body with strength and reflexes. Family details sit in the background like anchors you can tie a drifting story to. Ma's parents are named in the record as Frank Ma and Harriet Mort, and the family is described as English-speaking South Africans in Pretoria rather than as faceless colonials in a sepia fog. Cheshire Farm in Villieria appears in repeated accounts as the place Jackie comes from and the place Jackie will, in a different life, return to. Those geographic anchors matter because they are not generic Africa, they are specific human landscapes where farms exist at the edge of wild troop territories. The baboon's origin isn't a fairy tale about the bush, it's a byproduct of a bounty economy and a household decision. Ma lives inside those constraints, and then he walks out of them into khaki. When Ma decides to take Jackie with him, he can justify it in the only terms that matter inside a regiment: usefulness and morale. A baboon could guard a campsite by reacting loudly to strangers. A baboon could kill pests, because primates will opportunistically hunt small animals, and above all, a baboon could provide comfort in a camp where comfort is scarce and embarrassment is a weak deterrent. Soldiers already take dogs to war for protection and vermin control, so Ma's logic doesn't have to be perfectly sane to be legible to men who sleep with rifles. There's also superstition, because superstitious thinking blooms in environments where random death is common, and mascots get treated as portable luck. Ma loops the chain through his fingers, stands in front of Thackeray's authority, and frames the baboon not as his private pet but as a boon to the unit. Thackeray's approval, if it exists in writing, likely lives in a line of camp orders that few people ever read twice. The key act is not the sentence, it's the institutional behavior that follows: rations issued, uniform made, and the baboon treated as a tolerated part of the regiment's daily choreography. That choreography matters because it is how a dangerous animal becomes manageable, and manageability is the real currency of military life. Jackie outranks no one in any practical sense at this stage. The honorary private status is symbolic, but symbols shape how people behave around a body. Once men treat the baboon as ours rather than stray, they also become responsible for not provoking it, feeding it, and controlling it. The mascot becomes a collective project, which spreads the risk and deepens the attachment. The baboon that steps into that project is not a blank slate, it is a product of a specific species' evolutionary design. Papio ursinus is built for opportunistic foraging in variable landscapes, which means it eats a wide range of foods and constantly tests new options. In the Magaliesberg region, that flexibility makes baboons successful raiders. In a training camp, it makes them unstoppable opportunists around ration boxes. The animal's curiosity is not moral, it is adaptive, and a camp full of novel objects is a buffet for a mind that learns by touching. Jackie grabs, sniffs, and manipulates because that is how a baboon builds a map of the world without language. Every new object, cap badge, spoon, strap, is a lesson delivered through the fingertips. Wild chacmas also live inside social worlds dense enough to feel almost bureaucratic in their own way. Troops can range from around 20 individuals to well over 100, and in those groups, dominance hierarchies aren't background, they are the structure that determines who eats, who mates, and who gets punished for overstepping. Baboons' red posture, facial expression, and movement cues the way humans read paperwork, because bodies in primate societies broadcast rank and intent. Grooming isn't just hygiene, it is alliance maintenance, a tactile currency traded to reduce stress and build coalitions. A juvenile grows up learning who can be bullied, who must be appeased, and how fast a conflict can explode if a signal is misread. When Jackie watches officers and salutes, he is applying that same social cue machinery to a new species of troop. The sensory kit that supports that social world also maps cleanly onto a camp. Chacma juveniles have keen eyesight and acute hearing, and they use both to detect threats at the edges of their group's perimeter. A baboon climbs because climbing buys information, a higher vantage gives earlier detection of predators, rivals, or food. In Villieria, that might mean perching on a fence line and scanning for dogs or distant movement. In Potchefstroom, it might mean perching on a crate and tracking who approaches with a stick versus who approaches with a biscuit. The animal's nervous system doesn't need to know the difference between a leopard and a furious sergeant to react. It only needs to learn which patterns predict harm. Ma watches those reactions because he's handling a primate, not a machine, and the primate signals are the only early warning system he can't replace. Size and strength lurk behind the early juvenile photo like a future problem waiting for its appointment. Adult chacma males can reach around 40 kilograms, and even a smaller female or immature male carries enough muscle to injure a human badly with one defensive bite. That is why the chain matters, why the handler assignment matters, and why the camp has to decide how close strangers are allowed to lean in. It's also why the baboon's good behavior is not a simple personality trait. It is a balance between training, environment, and stress level that can tip if conditions change. A primate can tolerate a uniform when calm and tear it off when anxious, and the transition can happen in seconds. Ma keeps Jackie's world predictable because predictability reduces threat response, and threat response is what turns mascots into headlines. Potchefstroom's drill routine, with its repeated parades and commands, becomes a machine for manufacturing predictability. Jackie learns that certain voices correlate with certain movements and that certain movements correlate with food or praise, because learning is the nervous system's way of compressing experience into shortcuts. When the line halts, Jackie halts. When the line steps, Jackie steps, because group synchronization is rewarded socially even in baboon troops. Humans treat synchronous movement as discipline, but animals experience it as cohesion. Moving together reduces the chance of being singled out, which is survival logic in any social species. The camp's daily structure provides Jackie a surrogate troop, with Ma as the anchor individual and the regiment as the larger group to align with. The baboon isn't becoming human, it's becoming fluent in a new troop's rules. That fluency doesn't erase the strangeness, it weaponizes it. Every time an officer walks by and Jackie salutes, the gesture forces the officer to respond, because military etiquette is a mutual performance and the baboon has joined the stage. If the officer ignores the salute, he looks ridiculous to his men. If he returns it, he legitimizes the baboon's participation in the ritual. Either way, the animal manipulates the human hierarchy without intending to, simply by existing inside it. This is how institutions get bent, not always by rebellion, sometimes by a small creature performing the right movement at the wrong time. Thackeray's regiment can tolerate the bending because it doesn't yet threaten combat effectiveness, and in 1915 that is the only standard that matters. By the time the September photograph freezes Jackie among soldiers, the baboon has already been pulled into the regiment's bloodstream. Rations are being issued, uniforms are being worn, drills are being mimicked, and each of those actions ties an animal tighter to a unit that is preparing to leave Africa. Ma tightens the chain when the crowd gets too close and loosens it when Jackie behaves, because handling is the daily craft that decides whether this experiment continues. Officers tolerate the spectacle as long as it stays controllable, and the enlisted men reward it because it breaks monotony in a camp designed to grind personality down. Jackie, meanwhile, keeps doing the one thing a baboon always does in a new environment: watch the bodies, learn the signals, and adapt fast enough to stay fed. On the parade ground at Potchefstroom, under the hard light of 1915 Transvaal sun, Ma guides Jackie into formation and the baboon lifts an arm toward a passing officer as if the motion has always been part of its body. Ma knelt on the hard ground outside a bell tent at Potchefstroom and worked a tin of bully beef open with his clasp knife, the blade scraping metal in September 1915 while the 3rd South African Infantry drilled nearby. Jackie sat close enough that his shoulder brushed Ma's knee, and when Ma pinched off a greasy strip and held it out, the baboon didn't grab, he took it with a 2-finger precision that looked almost civilized in khaki light. Ma chewed his own ration, swallowed, then tipped his chin toward his sleeve as Jackie leaned in and began combing through the fabric with quick, exacting fingers. The grooming started before the joke did, and that mattered. Jackie made grooming into a contract because that's what grooming is in a baboon troop, and he performed it like a craft, not like a cuddle. In wild chacma groups on the Highveld, individuals trade minutes of parasite picking for access, alliance, and stress relief, and field studies show cortisol falling in blood samples while hands move through fur. Ma didn't need an endocrine lecture in Potchefstroom, he needed the practical result, and he got it when Jackie's breathing slowed under steady touch and his eyes stopped scanning for threats. He fed Jackie another strip of beef and let the animal keep working, turning a biological mechanism into a field expedient sedative. When the company broke for a short halt, a rifleman from the Transvaal regiment squatted in front of Jackie and tilted his head like a dog asking for scratches, and Jackie treated him like a puzzle. He dug into close-cropped hair, pinched out a louse, and popped it into his mouth with the casual efficiency of an animal built for opportunism, then moved to the seam of a tunic where lice hide in cloth folds. In 1915 the men fought infestations with hot water, harsh soap, and wishful thinking, and a baboon's hands could do in minutes what a man's nails couldn't manage all week. The soldier held still, the camp laughed, and the parasite load dropped anyway. Ma kept the bond alive by running a daily safety procedure that looked like pet ownership and functioned like risk management. Each morning in Potchefstroom he tightened Jackie's leather collar and slid 2 fingers underneath, because too tight meant skin sores and too loose meant a baboon vanishing into town. He clipped on a chain when strangers wandered through camp, then shortened it when wagons arrived, because a startled primate can bolt faster than a man can swear. The collar wasn't sentimental, it was infrastructure. The attachment also had a geography, and Ma shaped it with his body at Potchefstroom the way handlers do without naming the technique. He let Jackie sit against his hip when the sun dropped and the air cooled, and he carried the baboon's weight for short stretches when the ground burned feet, because physical proximity is how social mammals co-regulate heart rate and temperature. Jackie responded by tracking Ma's movements with the relentless focus of an infant, following him around cook fires, past latrine trenches, and back to the same patch of shade like it was a safe address. In a camp full of whistles, boots, and unfamiliar voices, Ma's smell became the map. Jackie's hands made affection dangerous, and Ma learned that lesson in the most boring possible way: theft. One afternoon in late 1915 a man set his haversack down outside a tent and Jackie slid over, fingers working the clasp with a locksmith's concentration, because primates don't respect personal property unless trained into it. The baboon pulled out soap and a tin cup, tested each with his teeth, then tried to run, and Ma caught him by the chain and hauled him back before those teeth could turn an argument into a wound. Around them, the men learned a second lesson: friendly is not a personality, it's a condition maintained by handling. At night the bond rewrote itself as simple thermodynamics. In the Transvaal winter of 1915, the temperature drop in a canvas tent made breath visible, and Ma folded a blanket around Jackie and felt the animal's heat soak into his sleeve. Jackie pressed closer, because clustering is how mammals cheat the cold, and he slept with his head near Ma's boots where the smell was strongest. That positioning wasn't cute, it was a locator beacon in fur. When a man rolled over in the dark, Jackie stirred and resettled like a sentry adjusting to a new shadow. October 1915 forced at anchor onto a moving deck. Ma walked Jackie up a troopship gangway with the chain short and his free hand gripping a rail, because a baboon that slips on wet planks can be gone in one sickening second. The ship's engines throbbed through the metal, the salt air coated the men's tongues, and Jackie flattened his ears at every clanging hatch as if the vessel itself were an angry animal. Ma crouched, fed him a piece of biscuit, and kept his palm on Jackie's back during the first violent roll, translating motion into contact. England made the bond public in a new way, because cold turns comfort into equipment. In late 1915 Ma wrapped Jackie in an extra blanket in a damp training camp and tucked the edge under the baboon's chin the way a sleeping toddler gets wrapped, because heat loss in a small body happens fast through exposed extremities. Jackie accepted the wrap, then immediately tried to pick at the knot with his fingers, because primates dislike restraint and love solving closures. Ma tightened it again and held his hand flat over the baboon's wrist until the animal surrendered, and the lesson was crude and effective: accept the blanket, keep his fingers to himself, stay alive. The men called it a trick, Ma treated it like a safety brief. The army's drill culture then did what drill culture always does: it tried to absorb the anomaly by forcing it into rhythm. On the parade ground in England, Ma positioned Jackie beside him when the line formed, because place is a command that doesn't require language. Jackie watched the men snap to attention and copied the posture by default, shoulders rising, spine stiffening, because imitation is a primate learning algorithm as old as grooming. When the command came to stand at ease, Ma shifted his own weight and Jackie shifted too, not understanding regulations and still building the habit that looks like obedience from the outside. Once Jackie could hold pattern, the pattern began training the human's back, which is where the comedy hid inside the mechanics. Jackie saluted when an officer approached, arm rising in a crooked parody of regulation, and the officer hesitated because returning a salute to a baboon is absurd and not returning it makes the officer look like the one who doesn't know the rules. Men watched, mouths tight, because ranks are a religion in uniform and nobody wants to see the sacrament broken. The officer returned the salute, and Jackie held still as if he'd just proven a theorem. The line laughed afterward, but the chain of command had been forced to acknowledge the animal's performance in its own language. Ma let that reversal happen on purpose the next time, because recognition in an institution is often a trap a soldier sets rather than a compliment he receives. He walked Jackie toward a senior officer in England, held the chain loose enough for Jackie to move, and kept his own hands off. Jackie saluted, the officer returned it, And the men behind Ma grinned with the relieved violence of people who have watched a social collision miss by inches. In an army, real is what the chain of command acknowledges in public. The permission mattered because it changed what people demanded of Ma. Once Jackie was more than a private joke, Ma became not just a rifleman but an interpreter responsible for a body that couldn't read orders. He had to decide when Jackie could roam the edge of camp and when the chain had to be short, because a baboon that bolts into a new unit's bivouac can trigger rifles and panic. He had to watch for signs of frustration, pacing, teeth grinding, sudden lunges, because primate aggression is fast and the consequences are literal blood. In exchange, Jackie watched him with the same intensity and kept learning the shape of together in a military world that tries to make everyone interchangeable. In January 1916, the management task stepped off a ship in Alexandria and into a world that smelled like diesel, animals, and dust. Ma guided Jackie down a gangway through shouting Port Laboris and stacks of crates, and Jackie paused long enough to lift his nose and sample air like a sentinel at a waterhole. Egypt's light hit differently from the Transvaal. It was harsher, flatter, and full of glare, and the camp outside Alexandria filled with flies and sweat and men learning to drink boiled water. Jackie moved close to Ma's leg as they threaded between tents, because proximity reduces threat when every new smell suggests danger. When the brigade pushed west into the Senussi campaign and the landscape turned into scrub and sand, Ma taught Jackie a new procedure by using the oldest one. He crouched behind a low rise in February 1916 and kept his rifle low, and Jackie crouched beside him because he had learned that Ma's posture predicted stillness. A baboon troop in the wild survives by keeping sentinels, individuals perched higher, scanning, ready to alarm, and Jackie slipped into that role the moment the environment demanded it. In the desert there are fewer walls to hide behind and more silence between noises, and Jackie's attention became one more set of eyes on a horizon that kept trying to kill them. Ma learned to read that attention the way a mechanic learns to read a machine that doesn't speak human language. When Jackie stiffened at movement in scrub, Ma didn't shoot. He watched the angle of Jackie's ears, the tension in shoulders, the direction of the gaze, because false alarms burn trust and wasted ammunition burns rations. He noted which reactions came with a low grunt and which came with nothing at all, because in a primate the voice is a signal and the silence can be, too. Over weeks in early 1916, Handler and Animal built a shared glossary out of posture and consequence, the only reliable language in a place that doesn't care who's brave. The one specific warning story that survives with a named human comes filtered through print rather than through a military report, which is exactly how morale stories travel. Private W. Hill wrote about Jackie's alertness during the Egyptian phase, and his account was later published in a Pretoria newspaper in 1917, giving the anecdote a date and a location even if it doesn't give a lab-grade sensory record. Hill describes men sleeping, an enemy approach he labels Turks, and Jackie growing agitated enough to wake the line before the threat arrived. Whether every detail lands perfectly, the structure is plausible. Fatigue dulls human vigilance, a primate sentinel reacts to abnormal movement, and the unit changes state from sleep to readiness because a baboon yanks them into it. Recognition arrived in the way recognition always arrives in a unit under stress. Someone survives and then refuses to stop talking about the thing that helped. After nights when Jackie's agitation dragged men out of sleep, rifles came up faster and eyes scanned harder, and even the men who thought the baboon was a nuisance began to treat him like a censor a man learns not to insult. Ma watched hands that had shoved Jackie away now offer him water from a canteen cap, because cooperation follows perceived utility. The joke didn't die, it just gained a second edge, the edge that comes when humor becomes equipment. That shift also changed what training meant, because the war environment in 1916 trained Jackie whether Ma wanted it or not. A sudden shot in the desert pairs noise with threat in a way no parade ground ever can, and Jackie's startle reflex began to calibrate to weapons rather than to shouted commands. Ma responded by keeping Jackie close during firing, because distance makes noise more terrifying and touch gives the brain a stable cue. He also fed Jackie after each barrage, because reinforcement can blunt panic by attaching fear to a predictable sequence. Boom, contact, food, calm. In a modern vocabulary it's conditioning, in a 1916 vocabulary it's simply making the animal manageable enough to keep alive. Around cook fires near Alexandria and later in staging camps, the men built Jackie's legitimacy by telling each other that he wasn't unique, just extreme. Someone would mention the Boer War of 1899 to 1902 and describe how commandos used whatever they had, including animals that could carry messages or simply keep watch. Someone else would bring up Winston Churchill's early war writing and repeat the odd detail that Churchill had noticed baboons named Jackie and Kruger among Boer forces, as if naming was already halfway to enlistment. The stories weren't evidence, they were permission slips passed hand to hand in smoke. The precedent that hit closest to home was the signalman Baboon, because it wore the same uniform logic as Jackie without requiring anyone to pretend it was human. In the 1880s in Cape Colony, a railway employee's baboon named Jack was trained to operate switches and signals, and newspaper accounts later bragged that in 9 years it never made an error that caused an accident. Soldiers in 1916 traded that story the way they traded tobacco, because it suggested that a baboon can learn precise cues and execute them under routine pressure. When Ma tightened Jackie's collar after hearing it, he wasn't thinking about Victorian railways, he was thinking about whether an animal can hold pattern long enough to keep men from dying. Then the wider mascot ecosystem flooded in, because the Great War turned companionship into a survival technology. The Royal Welsh Fusiliers goat marched as a living emblem of unit identity, and British camps treated it with the same mix of affection and discipline they applied to recruits. Ships kept cats because rats chew ropes and ruin food stores, and trench lines kept cats because rats chew sleeping men and steal crumbs. Dogs appeared everywhere, some trained for messages and some simply adopted because a warm body that wags is an antidote to a world that smells like cordite. In that crowded menagerie of morale, a baboon in uniform looked less like insanity and more like an especially honest form of it. South African units already had practice at institutional mascot care, which is one reason Jackie wasn't thrown overboard the first time he stole a biscuit. The 1st South African Infantry paraded a springbok antelope named Nancy as a symbol of home, and that symbol had to be fed, watered, and kept from bolting in crowds just like any other animal. When transport officers in Egypt issued orders about baggage loads and march discipline, they did it for humans, but the presence of Nancy and other mascots meant someone had already learned how to bend rules without snapping them. Jackie benefited from that accumulated unofficial expertise, the same way a clever soldier benefits from a quartermaster who has learned where paperwork can flex. Not every mascot story is sweet, and the baboon ones especially insist on physics. The South African Native Labour Corps, brought to France to move supplies and dig, had a baboon mascot named Peter, and Peter reportedly died of cold in northern France, an ending that reads like a weather report and lands like a verdict. That death matters because it reminds anyone that chacma baboons evolved for southern Africa's climate and for social clustering, not for Flanders winters and solitary tethering. An animal doesn't care what anyone calls it if it freezes. When soldiers laughed about Jackie's salute, the Peter story sat nearby like a quiet warning, keep him warm or bury him. Other baboons drifted through the war as proof Jackie wasn't alone. South African heavy artillery kept a baboon named Billy in France, and an engineering unit in Italy kept Dinks. Dink's chain failed on the 2nd of July, 1918 near Camusino, and a nervous soldier shot him, or treats sudden motion as enemy, and later a recovered tombstone made the accident feel grimly official. German propaganda loved the idea of trained baboon fighters, so officers bristled and Ma kept Jackie close when strangers with cameras wandered through camp. The war also exposed a quiet irony that soldiers rarely said out loud because saying it out loud would have been indecent in 1916. The 1st South African Infantry Brigade was an all-white volunteer formation, while black South Africans were often channeled into labor units like the Native Labour Corps, hauling and digging without the same combat status. In that racialized structure, a baboon could end up, on strength, as a mascot while many human men were denied the same recognition of soldierhood. That contradiction shows in the way the army clerk might stamp a form for Jackie's presence while a black laborer outside the tent shoulders crates that keep the war running and still doesn't get called a soldier. It's not a morality tale, it's a field observation about who institutions choose to see. Behind all the legend was the unromantic, daily question Ma had to answer, how a rifleman keeps a powerful primate stable while he moves through Egypt and toward France. In early 1916 he started with food, because food is the lever that moves most behavior in any camp, human and baboon alike. Army rations, hard biscuits, tinned meat, tea, whatever vegetables could be scrounged, were designed for men who could metabolize monotony and blunt appetite with cigarettes. Jackie could eat that diet, but an omnivorous primate's mood swings under nutritional boredom, and irritability in a baboon comes with canines. Ma broke biscuits into controlled pieces, fed after calm behavior, and made sure Jackie got scraps of fruit when he could steal them from supply, because the easiest way to prevent a fight is to prevent hunger. Water in Egypt in 1916 wasn't a background detail, it was a procedure with consequences, and it shaped, keeping, as much as chain links did. Ma filled canteens from boiled water points and watched Jackie drink in short bursts, because a primate can overheat fast when marching in kit. He shaded Jackie under a wagon at midday when the sun hammered camp, because heat stress in a mammal shows up as panting, lethargy, and bad judgment. Jackie, in turn, hugged the shade and stayed close, because his safest move in a foreign landscape was staying near the one creature who fed him on time. Water discipline sounds dull until the day it keeps a living mascot from collapsing and turning into a corpse the unit has to explain. Hygiene became a shared ecosystem problem, and Jackie's grooming both helped and complicated it. He likely got infested along with the men, but unlike the men he could remove parasites with instinctive efficiency, pinching and pulling and eating them before they could spread. In doing so he also satisfied his own behavioral need to groom, which reduces stress and maintains social bonds in a troop, meaning the act carried both medical and psychological utility. Disease exposure ran both directions. Living close to humans meant Jackie breathed their coughs and tasted their germs, and humans lived inches from an animal whose bites could infect. Ma watched for sores around the collar, cleaned what he could with the same rough water they used on their own bodies, and hoped the war didn't add rabies scare to the paperwork pile. When dysentery hit, Ma couldn't solve it with affection, so he solved it with presence and routine. He lay weak in a tent or ward in 1916, and Jackie stayed beside him instead of wandering off to better food, because attachment in a primate can override opportunism when the anchor looks like it's dying. Men brought water and watched Jackie hover, agitated, because an animal that normally patrols and steals becomes a barometer when it refuses to leave. Ma, when he could lift his hand, touched Jackie's shoulder and kept contact going, because separating now would have created a second emergency on top of the first. In a war where men vanish daily, staying becomes a skill. Restraint was the constant background procedure that made everything else possible, and Ma treated it as a risk calculation. Jackie wore his leather collar and, when camps filled with strangers or rifles started cracking, Ma clipped on a chain, because a baboon can sprint and climb out of a trench faster than a man can react. Wire, trip hazards, and jumpy sentries turned that agility into a friendly fire problem. In Egypt in 1916, Ma kept him busy chasing rats and shredding old sandbags behind the cookhouse, because boredom and tethering make teeth. Noise was the enemy that never stopped, and the ways the men managed Jackie's reactions in 1916 sound like field improvisations of modern trauma care. Early in Egypt Jackie hid under blankets during explosions, pressing his body into the ground to reduce sensory input, the mammal equivalent of trying to shrink away from a pressure wave. Over time he habituated enough to function, but habituation is not immunity. A startle reflex can be suppressed in the moment and still imprint, rewiring threat circuits deeper than conscious control. Ma stayed close during barrages, kept a hand on Jackie's back, and rewarded calm afterward with food because the brain learns associations whether an army wants it to or not. Ma built Jackie a sleeping spot the way he built his own, by stealing scraps and shoving them into a corner. In a 1916 Egyptian bivouac outside Alexandria he rolled a greatcoat into a nest, dropped a blanket inside, and watched Jackie circle once before curling down. Ma kept the chain short enough that Jackie couldn't blunder into cook fires or strange tents in the dark, because a sleep-deprived baboon wakes up with teeth. Even medical policy became part of keeping, and it's one of the clearest signs that Jackie was treated as more than a tolerated pet. After the Battle of Agadir on the 26th of February, 1916, Ma was wounded in the right shoulder and recovered in hospital in Alexandria, a place built for human infection control and convalescence. Later summaries preserve the astonishing administrative detail that Jackie stayed with him during recovery and that permission was granted because separating them would distress both, which is a medical argument and a moral argument at once. A medical officer could watch a baboon in khaki and choose pragmatism over paperwork, because a restless animal in a ward is a hazard and a calmer patient heals faster. A medical officer could bend policy for a plain military reason. The baboon's distress risked slowing human recovery, and sentiment becomes logistics when it affects convalescence. By April 1916 the South African Brigade left Egypt for France, and Ma pushed Jackie through ship holds and onto trains as if he were another piece of kit. In a packed rail car, coal smoke stinging eyes, Jackie climbed onto baggage so he could watch faces, because sightlines are safety in a social species. France replaced desert glare with trench geometry, blind corners, gas alerts, a constant rumble, and the line's real job became detecting movement before it reached the trench line. Dogs did it with noses and barks. Jackie did it by perching and freezing when something in the dark didn't belong. On a cold night when the front went quiet enough to hear rats, Ma watched Jackie lift his head and listen hard into the dark. That listening had already been tested in a place with no duckboards and no parapets, just the Libyan wind flinging sand hard enough to sting the eyes and grind into anything wet. On the 26th of February, 1916 at Agadir, in the Senussi campaign's bad geometry of open ground and scattered scrub, Private Albert Ma of the 3rd South African Infantry jerks as a round takes him through the shoulder and knocks the rifle out of his working grip. Jackie doesn't sprint away with the smart mammals. He drops into a crouch over Ma's body, plants his hands on the man's tunic like he's pinning down a panicked troop mate, and turns his head toward the crackle of fire with his mouth open in a dry, silent threat. Ma tries to sit, fails, and then forces himself into the smaller, uglier work of staying conscious while blood runs down into the cloth at his armpit and dust clings to it like a second skin. Jackie leans in and drags his tongue across the wound in quick strokes, not gently and not symbolically, but with the same practical insistence a primate uses to clean a cut in its own troop, scraping away grit and blood that would otherwise crust into a paste. In 1916 that action is both help and hazard. A mouth can remove sand, but saliva is not antiseptic, and every open wound in a desert fight is already a petri dish the size of an empire. The point isn't that a baboon, new medicine, the point is that Jackie physically stays put under fire long enough for Ma's breathing to slow and for the next human action in the chain to happen, someone else finding them. Stretcher bearers come in low, the way men move when they've watched too many heads snap back in the open, and Jackie meets them with bare teeth and the rigid shoulders of an animal defending possession. One bearer grips the stretcher pole tighter and jabs the other with a look that says, "Not today, not this nonsense," while Ma lifts his good hand and uses it like a tool, pressing down on Jackie's forearm in a calming cue he's used since Potchefstroom in August 1915. The bearers slide their hands under Ma, lift him, and the wound pulls with a wet sound that makes Ma swallow hard. Jackie hops alongside, then climbs onto the stretcher with the simple logic of social attachment. Whatever else the battle is, the immediate physics is this: two bodies on canvas and wood, carried toward a dressing point because the unit can still spare for men to haul one. At the dressing station the work becomes procedure. A medical orderly cuts cloth, rinses with whatever water is available, packs gauze, and binds Ma's shoulder with the same indifferent competence he'd use on any infantryman. Jackie won't let a hand come near the bandage without lunging, so the men solve it the oldest way, by moving him, not reasoning with him, one soldier bracing his shoulders while Ma keeps talking in a low voice that holds Jackie's attention like a leash. The officer who signs off on this circus does it with a pencil and a weary glance, because in early 1916 the South Africans are still a long way from France and still in that phase of war where the absurd has not yet become normal. An animal in a field medical space is a hygiene problem, a liability, and now, because he physically refuses to separate, a management problem that no one has a regulation for. Alexandria turns the scene from battlefield improvisation into institutional tolerance. Ma lies on a cot in a hospital ward, his shoulder bandaged, his service number 4927 tied to his paperwork, and Jackie wedges himself at the foot of the bed as if the cot has a territorial boundary worth enforcing. A nurse steps in with a tray and tries to shoo him with her apron, then stops when Ma's face tightens and his pulse visibly spikes. Separating them isn't just emotionally cruel, it's medically counterproductive in a pre-antibiotic world where rest and appetite are the thin line between recovery and downward spiral. Jackie grims Ma's hand and then grims his own chest, spreading whatever comfort a primate can spread through touch, while orderlies mutter about rules and then break them because the rulebook has never contained a baboon who will literally not leave. When Jackie himself falls sick in March 1916, accounts describe stress and dysentery, that brutal trench and camp companion that dehydrates faster than men can replace water. He doesn't pace a cage. He curls near Ma and goes still, looking piteous enough that the staff, against all logic, treat the animal like a patient instead of a pest. That early episode stays in the record for a practical reason. When the next crisis arrives, Ma uses it as evidence, not poetry. 2 years later, when a Royal Army Medical Corps officer asks why anyone should expend chloroform and bandages on a baboon, Ma doesn't give a speech about loyalty. He gives the desert date and the hospital scene and insists the animal has already paid into the system with blood and behavior. A story survives in war the way a man survives in war, by being carried forward in someone else's hands. On the 17th of April, 1918, in the Kemmel sector around Reeninghelst in West Flanders, the carrying turns violent again. The 3rd South African Infantry has already been disbanded in February and its survivors folded into the 4th South African Scottish, an administrative tidying that only looks neat if you're not counting bodies. And Ma and Jackie are still physically attached to whatever unit is left to attach them to. Shells come in with that shallow descending whistle that doesn't give you time to decide whether to run or freeze. They decide for you by throwing fragments into the air like a hand tossing nails. Ma drops into whatever cover he can find and Jackie scrabbles beside him, and then shrapnel hits in the way it always hits, without interest in species, rank, or story. Witnesses later describe Jackie trying to build a stone wall, and the detail lands because it is so animal and so human at once. He grabs loose chunks of rock with hands built for climbing and food, stacks them against himself and Ma, and keeps stacking even as the ground shakes. That is not a tactical fortification, it is a panicked cover response turned into labor, the same kind of frantic debris piling baboons do at burrow mouths to block an intrusion. redirected by the immediate problem of metal in the air. A fragment tears into Jackie's right leg and nearly severs it, another opens his right arm, and blood soaks the sleeve of the khaki uniform someone once laughed while tailoring in England. Ma, wounded again, tries to drag himself toward Jackie with one good shoulder and finds that the mud and the pain have turned movement into a slow argument he is losing. Stretcher bearers arrive under pressure, because April 1918 isn't a neat front line anymore. It's a moving collapse of positions and a surge of casualties that turns every track into a lane of men on canvases. Jackie sees the bearers' hands and snaps at them, not understanding evacuation as care, only understanding removal as threat, and his injured leg makes the aggression clumsy but not less determined. One bearer raises his arm instinctively to protect his face, another curses and reaches for a blanket like it's a net, and Ma pushes himself up far enough to get his hand on Jackie's shoulder and hold him still through sheer force of habit. The bearers lift Jackie anyway, because the unit has already crossed the line where the baboon is, on strength, in the only sense that matters. When someone is bleeding, you put him on the stretcher and you move. At the assault dressing station the air is thick with iodine, sweat, and that metallic smell that comes off too much blood in too small a space. A veterinary officer reportedly looks at the mangled leg first, because if you have an animal in the system you reach for the animal chain of expertise, and then steps back because he has horses and mules in his training, not a Chakma baboon in a uniform, and this is a surgical emergency. Captain R.N. Woodsend of the RAMC takes the case because it is in front of him and because the war has already trained him to stop asking whether a body belongs and start asking whether it will die in the next hour. He lays out instruments that look absurdly normal in the context of an absurd patient: scissors, clamps, bandages, and a sponge soaked in chloroform. Chloroform is a blunt tool, a liquid that turns into vapor and then into unconsciousness by depressing the central nervous system, and dosing it in 1918 is an art practiced with eyes and timing more than numbers. Woodsend holds the sponge to Jackie's mouth and, in the account that keeps getting repeated because it's too strange to leave out, Jackie laps at it as if it were whiskey, taking the anesthetic in the only way a frightened animal might accept anything from a stranger, by grabbing control of the sensation. The baboon's breathing slows, his muscles loosen, and the room briefly shifts from chaos to that surgical stillness where every motion becomes deliberate. Woodsend cuts, clamps, and ties, amputating the shattered right leg around mid-tibia with field-expedient decisiveness, then cleans and dresses the deep wound in the right arm, leaving it intact because the tissue can be saved. While Woodsend works, Mart does his own kind of work. He stays close despite his own injuries, watches the knife hand motions with a face that gives away nothing useful, and then breaks down anyway because this is the only thing left he can control, how hard he pleads. He sobs out the old desert proof, the line about Egypt and dysentery, not as sentiment but as argument, because in a triage system you don't want to be an animal, you want to be a comrade with prior service. When Woodsend finishes, he doesn't end the case with a flourish, he ends it with paperwork, because paperwork is how the machine of care continues. Someone gives an antitetanus injection into flesh already traumatized, because Flanders mud is basically an invitation to a disease that kills by locking muscles until breathing stops. Ma forces the next sentence through his throat as if it physically costs him, and Woodsend later preserves it because it is the key that turns the lock. He is on army strength. That phrase isn't romance, it's a switch. The staff tag Jackie like any other wounded, right, Corporal Jackie, 3rd SAI, on a case sheet because the unit's informal reality has to be translated into administrative fact, and then push the stretcher into the evacuation lane where ambulances take bodies toward the rear. The 36th Casualty Clearing Station at Raasbrug is not a stage for legend. It's a throughput machine built to stabilize and forward, and its commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel William Martin Harvey, has spent his career turning bleeding into survivable. He receives a baboon the way he receives any odd casualty in war, by making space, assigning responsibility, and not letting the spectacle slow the flow. At Raasbrug a nurse changes Jackie's dressings with hands that have already changed hundreds of dressings that week, and Jackie wakes into pain with the confused rage of an animal whose body map has been altered. Three-legged locomotion isn't just missing a leg, it's a complete rewrite of gait in a quadruped, a new load pattern that forces the remaining hind limb and opposite forelimb to absorb stresses they weren't built to carry all day. Jackie tests the stump, jerks back, then tries again, because pain does not stop an animal from attempting the movement its nervous system expects, it just changes the learning rate. Ma, patched up nearby, watches him practice as if he's watching a child learn to walk, except the stakes are infection, breakdown of the stump, and chronic joint strain that will chew through whatever years the war hasn't already stolen. A commanding officer comes through the ward at some point in that convalescent stretch, exact name varies by retelling, and Jackie reportedly sits up and salutes with his bandaged arm. Whether the salute is perfect or approximate almost doesn't matter, the action functions as signal, and the humans around the bed react the way the army has trained them to react to a salute, which is to interpret it as discipline and dignity. That interpretation is contagious. A war correspondent arrives at a base hospital a few days later, on the 21st of April, 1918 in Woodson's recollection, and he chooses his scene the way journalists always do. He walks past rows of bodies that are too ordinary in their suffering to carry a narrative, stops at the bed with the baboon, and lifts his pencil. The correspondent watches Jackie raise an arm, watches the officer receive it, and writes the gesture into print as moral evidence. The Times publishes on the 22nd of April, 1918 and drops a phrase that sticks because it's tidy and flattering: a baboon among our heroes, a hero among our heroes. One small furry body that can stand in for imperial sacrifice without forcing the reader to picture gas gangrene or a man drowning in his own blood. The paper makes the hospital scene portable. It ships it to breakfast tables where civilians can digest war without tasting it. Jackie does not understand the article, but he does understand the attention around his bed, the way hands offer fruit, the way voices soften when they say his name. And attention is a reinforcer so clean it should come with a warning label. The recognition machine clicks into place because the army only knows one way to honor a body: it attaches cloth and metal to it. Someone sews a gold wounded in action stripe to Jackie's sleeve, pins or stitches on service chevrons, and adds a good conduct stripe as if the animal has been resisting temptation in barracks for years. Accounts describe 4 blue overseas service chevrons for 1915 through 1918, though other descriptions wobble on the count, which is exactly what happens when memory talks about symbols more than it talks about procedures. The irony, clean enough to be funny and sharp enough to hurt, is that the stripes make Jackie outrank his owner on paper, a corporal to Mars private, which means the army has created a loop in its own hierarchy and then pretended the loop is a line. A tailor's needle does not care, it goes in and out of wall, turning experience into geometry. By late summer 1918 the war is still chewing men, but Jackie and Mar are no longer in the mouth, they are in the digestive tract of convalescence. Dressings get changed on schedule. Stumps get inspected for heat and smell. Arms get flexed carefully so scar tissue doesn't lock joints into permanent limitation. Jackie tests his balance again and again, shifting weight forward onto hands that were meant for climbing trees, now pressed into service as crutches on hospital floors. Mar adjusts his grip on the leash because one sudden lurch on 3 legs can split a healing wound, and he moves with the cautious patience of a handler who has learned that recovery is mostly the prevention of stupid accidents. Then the machine discovers a second use for them. In September 1918, as the war's end approaches but the money needs keep rising, Jackie and Mar get attached to the British Red Cross and turned into fundraising apparatus. The terms are preserved with the kind of specificity that sounds like satire until you remember it was printed: 2 shillings and 6pence to shake Jackie's hand, 5 shillings to kiss him. Mar stands there in uniform or near enough, holds the leash short, and presents Jackie like a relic that can be touched for a fee, while donors produce coins and the Red Cross counts them into ledgers that will buy bandages for someone else's ripped body. The transaction works because it converts distance into intimacy. You pay to cross the boundary between civilian and the front, and Jackie's hand becomes the bridge. At one event in January 1919 a brass band strikes up close enough to punch the air with sound, and Jackie reacts the way a war-shaped nervous system reacts. He jolts, bares teeth, and tries to bolt, because loud sudden noise is no longer music, it is incoming. Mar drags him outside by force, not cruelty, because the leash is the only thing between panic and teeth in a crowd, and because primate hearing does not come with a mute switch. Someone improvises a solution that's both ridiculous and humane, stuffing cotton into Jackie's ears like makeshift earmuffs during later performances, the same crude trick a parent uses on a child at fireworks. The War Office even budgets his feeding like he's a line item in a supply chain, 3 shillings a day in a December 1918 communique, because once something becomes part of a public campaign, bureaucracy must pretend it always had a category for it. In November 1918, in London's Lord Mayor's show, Jackie reportedly rides in uniform and turns his face toward cheering crowds who have never smelled cordite but are happy to applaud its products. Whether you imagine him perched on a carriage rail or held by Mar in a tight grip, the physical fact is that an amputee baboon is being used as civic spectacle while the armistice is still fresh enough to taste. People lean in, laugh, point, and then go home feeling a little cleaner about the war because they have petted something that survived it. Jackie, for his part, scans faces and hands and learns the rhythms of applause, because a primate reads a crowd the way water reads a slope. Sometime around early March 1919, Jackie and Ma cross the channel and then the equator and head back towards South Africa, not as anonymous demobilized bodies but as named story and named attraction. Ma keeps Jackie close on deck because a ship is a moving platform with unfamiliar noises, and because a three-legged gate on wet planks is a fall waiting to happen. When Cape Town appears, the return becomes paper again. On the 26th of April, 1919, at Maitland Dispersal Camp outside Cape Town, a clerk pushes a printed discharge certificate across a desk and, in an act so bureaucratically pure it could be framed, discharges a baboon from military service. The discharge is not just a souvenir, it's an institutional action with consequences. It includes a pension and a civil employment form, symbolic in a way that reveals how paperwork creates realities even when those realities make no biological sense. Ma takes the papers because he has always taken papers seriously. Papers are what allowed Jackie into the army, what allowed him through hospitals, what allowed him into fundraising halls without someone deciding to solve the problem with a rifle butt. Jackie cannot read the document, but he watches Ma fold it, because the folding itself is a cue that a phase is ending. The bureaucracy has done its final trick. It has turned 4 years of risk into a clean rectangle of ink. In May 1919, Pretoria stages its victory parade, and Jackie stages himself. He moves on 3 legs down streets he knew as a farm-raised animal, now wearing a uniform with stripes, leading or near the head of a returning contingent that still smells faintly of Europe's mud even after the voyage. Spectators press in, shout, and laugh, and Jackie lifts his arm in a salute that the crowd interprets as gratitude, because crowds always interpret. Ma keeps the leash tight enough to prevent a bolt, and Jackie keeps moving because the parade is a controlled corridor of sound and motion, and animals can do corridors if their handler holds the boundary. A year later, on the 31st of July, 1920, during Peace Day celebrations in Pretoria, a city official pins the Pretoria Citizen Service Medal to Jackie's coat in front of a large crowd, the metal touching cloth that once lay under shrapnel. The pinning is a precise physical act. Fingers find the fabric, the clasp bites, the medal hangs and swings, adding a small weight to a body already living with missing muscle and altered balance. Cameras click or people stare or both, and a baboon becomes civic property in the public mind, a mascot elevated into a symbol that can be honored without understanding. Ma stands close enough to catch Jackie if he flinches, because even in peace the handler's job is still accident prevention. Back at Cheshire Farm in Villiers near Pretoria, the public ceremony collapses into domestic routine the way war always collapses when it ends, into meals, fences, and weather. Neighbors later recall seeing Jackie riding on Ma's shoulder or sitting on the veranda, the uniform sometimes still worn because habits survive longer than reasons. Jackie uses his hands to climb because the missing hind limb makes climbing a different puzzle, and he learns new sequences the way animals always do, by falling a little, adjusting, and trying again. Ma watches his stump for sores and his gait for strain, because chronic overuse in the remaining joints will be the long tail of a decision made in Potchefstroom in 1915. In this setting the war is not a story, it's a nervous system that has been trained to expect catastrophe. When thunderstorms roll over the farm, Jackie reacts with a fear that exceeds ordinary animal caution. He hears the pressure wave crack of thunder and bolts toward whatever cover is nearest, claws scrabbling on hard ground, breathing fast enough to strip carbon dioxide out of his blood and tip him into that dizzy edge between flight and collapse. Ma tries to intercept him with the leash on his own body, because a panicking primate can hurt itself or others in seconds, and because Ma's instinct, always, is to manage. In some accounts a farmhouse fire or fright from a low-flying plane is part of the trigger, in others it's the thunder itself, but the shared mechanism is the same, an animal already tuned too high goes beyond its ceiling. On the 22nd of May, 1921 Jackie dies, the date stable even when the sensory trigger wobbles, and Ma is left holding a body that no medal can make meaningful. The burial that follows is oddly elusive in the historical record, which is what happens when grief occurs offstage. One report has Ma digging into the farm soil in Villiers and lowering Jackie into a grave without a monument, just earth and the rough tenderness of a man who has never been good at public language. Another hints at a burial near Premier Mine, a different geography, a different dirt, the kind of detail that might reflect a family connection or a later conflation. What stays consistent is that the animal's remains disappear into South African ground while the uniformed image keeps circulating, because bodies decay and stories don't. Ma's shovel, wherever it bit into earth, performed the one action the army never did, it removed Jackie from usefulness. The human afterlife of Jackie stretches because people keep picking up the story and handling it like an object. In 1950, veterans of the memorable Order of Tin Hats fill moth, shell holes, columns with recollections, and in the act of writing they turn memory into print, repeating details that behave like informal corroboration, Kemmel, the stone wall, the amputation, the salute. In the same year, Woods End publishes recollections in a medical journal, The Practitioner, and sets Jackie back into a professional frame. Chloroform, scissors, triage, because doctors remember by procedure as much as by emotion. A story that began as a baboon licking grit off a shoulder now lives in two kinds of archive, the veteran's convivial memory and the clinician's case history. Those later accounts also preserve a small, bleak fact about Ma's own life trajectory. Veteran notes remember him after Jackie's death as a pensioner inseparable from other animals, specifically a Siamese cat and a fox terrier, as if he kept rebuilding the same emotional scaffolding with whatever species would accept it. Ma dies in Pretoria in August 1973 at age 84, and the obituary memory of him collapses down to the wartime Bond, calling him Private Ma, Jackie's owner, as if his identity is a footnote to an animal's legend. Even in death, the human gets filed under the baboon. That is not poetic, that is how public memory economizes. One striking image replaces a whole person. If you watch the story travel across those decades, you can see exactly where it fattens into nonsense. Someone, somewhere, wants a baboon with a rifle, because audiences are addicted to agency that looks like theirs, and a baboon comforter is too intimate, too domestic, too close to admitting that survival often depends on small caretaking actions rather than cinematic violence. So later retellings hand him captures and formal gallantry medals and other embroidered fantasies that require no paperwork. The corrective isn't a scolding, it's a desk scene. You put the discharge certificate dated the 26th of April, 1919 next to the Times piece dated the 22nd of April, 1918. You lay Woodsend's 1950 medical recollection beside the Red Cross fundraising terms from September 1918 to February 1919, and you notice that the Real story is already bizarre enough without adding props. Even the seemingly simple facts wobble under scrutiny in ways that teach you how legend forms. A local newspaper, the Loughborough Echo in November 1918, calls Jackie a female baboon of 4.5 years, a detail that conflicts with the universal he in most retellings and forces you to look at photographs with an unromantic eye. Experts point out the lack of a prominent manner and the animal's size in some images, but photographic evidence is inconclusive because the lens lies by omission and because people didn't take these photos to answer future sexing debates, they took them to marvel. A name wobbles too, with some secondary sources calling Ma, Andrew, and later historians, like Vincent Carruthers, having to tug the record back toward Albert and toward the service file skeleton of enlistment and wounds. This is the point where epistemic hygiene becomes physical. You hold the clipping, you read the line, you admit you don't know, and you do not paper over uncertainty with confident charm. The deeper discomfort isn't that the story gets exaggerated, it's that the unexaggerated version still forces a category collision we don't know how to resolve. In the war, a rank stripe is an instrument of command. It tells other humans which orders to obey, which voices carry authority, and which bodies are permitted to punish disobedience. When a tailor stitches corporal stripes onto a baboon in 1918, the cloth doesn't magically grant comprehension of nation-states, and it doesn't grant consent, it grants legibility to the humans watching. Jackie can learn drills because primate brains are built to mirror, because reinforcement is relentless, and because social attention changes behavior as surely as hunger does. Jackie can stay beside Ma under fire because attachment changes risk calculus at the level of hormones and gut-level panic, and because separation from the bonded figure can feel worse than pain. None of that requires belief in king and country, and pretending it does is the simplest way humans have found to turn animals into moral ornaments. That is why the most revealing actions in the whole story aren't the dramatic ones, they are the bureaucratic ones. A clerk stamps a discharge paper at Maitland as if it settles an account. A War Office memo assigns 3 shillings a day to feeding of baboon, as if the Empire can price a living nervous system like oats for a mule. A fundraiser sets a 5-shilling fee for a kiss as if intimacy with suffering can be retailed without residue. These are not footnotes, these are the mechanisms by which a modern state metabolizes the unclassifiable. If you want to know what a society believes, watch what it does with forms. The animal's final vote in this economy is silent, because death ends performance. Jackie's body goes into the ground without a widely known grave marker, while the story keeps walking on 3 legs through newspapers, veteran magazines, and the polite chaos of the internet. Somewhere in that long afterlife, a researcher opens a folder, slides out a photograph dated the 15th of September, 1915 at Potchefstroom showing a very small baboon among troops, and feels the little jolt of recognition that this was never a metaphor, it was fur and bone and risk. Someone else reads the Pretoria newsletter from 1917 signed by W. Hill describing the Turks in the dark, and hears, behind the quaint phrasing, the operational fact. Men were outsourcing perception wherever they could. Every artifact is a handhold, and every handhold is also a warning about how easy it is to climb into the wrong conclusion. In the end, the cleanest scene to hold on to is not the parade or the kiss for a coin spectacle, but an 8-station table near Reninghurst on the 17th of April, 1918, where a surgeon presses chloroform to a baboon's mouth and then cuts away a leg so the patient won't die of infection, because that is the story stripped down to what war actually is: humans dragging other living things into their machinery and then trying, sometimes sincerely, to keep the recruited bodies from breaking completely. The medal on the coat and the rank on the sleeve are how we soothe ourselves afterward. The blood on the floor is the part that was always real. When someone closes the folder on Jackie's case sheet, the paper makes a soft sound, and it's hard not to hear in it the human reflex that never changes, the need to turn a body into a story so we can carry it without feeling the weight.